Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another lesson of East End Online Sunday School. This is lesson 28 we're going to look at this week, and we're going to talk about the Ice Age, something you've probably never thought of when looking at the Bible, but we're going to talk about how the Bible explains the Ice Age and what that actually means. We still have the same memory verse from last week, John 10:9, and Jesus said, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture." So certainly an important verse for us to understand. There's only one way in and out of fellowship with God, and once you're in, you're in. If you're out, you're out. And the door, the gateway, that is Jesus, the only way we can find salvation. So we start off with the question, how many ice ages have there been? And we're not talking about the movies, because there have been a ton of those, right? If you're familiar with those cartoons. Scientifically, they say that there have been multiple ice ages over millions of years, that the Earth has heated and cooled and heated and cooled and heated and cooled, and that it caused the extinction of many animals and this and that. But certainly we know that model doesn't work out with the biblical creation timeline. If the Earth is only roughly 6,000 years old, we couldn't have had millions of years of different ice ages and certainly different cooling periods. But we are going to see from a biblical perspective, there is a way to mesh those two things together. The fact that there was an ice age and the fact that the Bible describes or can describe, and the biblical model can fit in with that ice age, or rather we should say an ice age can fit in with the biblical model, because we start with the Bible being the truth and we build our scientific discoveries around that, not the other way around. So just a quick lesson recap. Remember we talked about Noah's Ark last week, a biblical description of the ark and the cargo that it carried. And so the dimensions of the ark given in the Bible, it said that it was 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. And we spent some time talking about what is a cubit, and really it's the actual dimension is from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger, which is roughly 18 inches. It could have been anywhere between 18 and 21 inches. In practical work, there was something called a long cubit, which would have been the 21 inches. The shorter cubit would have been 18 inches, and then something called a royal cubit, which would have been about 20.4 inches. And that's what was used here to convert our cubits to feet. And as we look at those values, and they're taking a little while to fill in, but we see that the ark would have been 510 feet by 85 feet by 51 feet. So a huge endeavor, a huge construction project. We won't go all into the details again, but certainly God had a plan and God prepared through Noah for this flood with the ark. So this week, as we talk about the Ice Age, these are our two lesson objectives. The first is to describe the connection between the flood and the Ice Age, and the second will be to recognize God's attributes displayed in the uniformity of his creation. And we'll talk more about that word uniformity as we go on. So first, a lesson overview. This is what we're going to be looking at in this lesson, like we've already talked about a little bit. The Bible does not directly speak of an ice age. So we said at the beginning the Bible explains the ice age, but the Bible actually does not directly speak of an ice age. And when we think of an ice age, that would be a period of extreme cold, right? There'd be glaciers covering massive areas of land. Everything would be frozen. Not everything, but a lot of things would be frozen. So even though the Bible doesn't talk about it directly, it doesn't make it biblically or unbiblical or biblically untrue, right? The Bible doesn't talk about motorcycles either. So that certainly the Bible is not supposed to be a be-all, end-all for all discoveries, for all scientific things that have ever happened in the earth, for all historical things that were happening, right? We don't know what was happening in China when Jesus was walking the earth, because it doesn't matter. It wasn't the point of the Bible. The point of the Bible is to describe God to us and how we can have a relationship with him through Jesus, our Savior, and really following that along from Genesis all the way to Revelation. So there are a lot of things the Bible doesn't talk about. It doesn't make them unbiblical, but we need to make sure that we have the understanding that whatever we find, whatever supposed research or discoveries we have, they have to align with biblical truths instead of creating contradictions. So we don't look up something, as fallible man and say, well, this is what I found, and so if the Bible doesn't support that, the Bible's wrong. That's having the wrong perspective. You're going the wrong direction there. We have to start with the idea that the Bible is right, and because the Bible is right, anything I find has to be accurate in light of the Bible. right? That's really what having a biblical worldview is. Everything has to fall back in place and in perspective in light of God's truths from the Bible. And if it doesn't, it's not God that's wrong, it's me that's wrong, or maybe not wrong, but I don't have enough information to draw this conclusion the way that I've drawn it. So before we go into all that with the Ice Age, we're going to remind ourselves of one of the promises that God made to Noah, and by that, also a promise that he's made to all of us as well. So we go back into Genesis 8, and we will start in Genesis 8, chapter 8, verse 20. And then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So just to remind ourselves of what was happening in this passage that we just read and that we've talked about really the last few weeks, why was Noah offering a sacrifice to the Lord? Well, remember the flood had just ended. They just got off the boat. Noah's sacrifice was in response to God's preserving him and his family during the flood. How did God view Noah's sacrifice? It said he considered it a pleasing aroma. And what do we learn about the condition of the heart of man? In this passage, we're again reminded that the intention of man's heart is evil from youth. So even though he saved Noah and his family, those 8, we still know that Noah and his family were under that sin curse. They inherited that sin curse and that sinful nature, just like the rest of us do. What did God promise in verse 21? In verse 21, he said he would never again destroy every living thing with a flood. And how did he confirm that promise in verse 22? When God described how he would uphold creation. And in upholding creation, he mentions a few different cycles and a few different patterns that we are going to see from now until the point in time where this earth ends and passes away, under God's direction and authority. And those cycles, it says seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. And these cycles will not end while the earth exists. And so we know, the end of the story already. Some of us do, most of us do maybe, that there's going to be a new heaven. There's going to be a new earth. But while this earth exists, there can be changes, there can be fluctuations, there can be patterns we may not expect, or what seem like breaks in those patterns. But there will always be seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, from now until when Jesus comes back. What is the context of this passage? And so that's kind of a loaded word when we think about it just briefly this morning. But remember, what's happening around here, what culturally, what was happening historically, what was happening at this point in time. And certainly we've seen from Genesis 6 through Genesis 9, really, well, at least the beginning of chapter 9, and that we were talking about the flood and the flood account, what happened leading up to the flood, during the flood, right after the flood, which is really where Genesis 8, 20 through 22 takes place. And so remember that there are only 8 people that remained on the earth after the flood at this point. God was essentially restarting his creation. He hit the reset button and gave Noah and his descendants the mandate to be fruitful and fill the earth. And this took place roughly about 2400 BC. So, we wouldn't mark it on a calendar and say this is exactly when it happened, but it's going to be in that time frame of about 2400 BC. And remember how we arrive at that. We had those genealogies and well, specifically the genealogy in Genesis 5, and you're able to just really add the numbers up. And so when you take that genealogy, the genealogy in Genesis 11, some extra biblical work that was done to figure out the amount of time between Abraham and Jesus, then we can start to backtrack, and that's where these numbers start to come from. And we talked about that a lot of lessons ago, maybe lesson 11. If you wanted to go back and find that, you certainly could. What does this passage tell us about God? God has promised to uphold his creation in an orderly manner despite mankind's constant depravity. Right? And this is God's promise. It's not contingent upon anything. God made the promise, and we know that God is faithful, and God has since then and will continue to keep his promise and all of his promises moving forward. This passage reminds us that God has designed the universe we live in to operate according to certain laws and patterns. And we mentioned a few that he mentioned in Genesis 8, the seed time and harvest, cold and hot, summer and winter, day and night. this is the reason why we're able to study things in a scientific manner. It wouldn't be possible to study and really form entire disciplines off of these patterns if things were happening randomly and for no reason. Right? If things happen randomly and for no reason, there is no pattern and there's nothing that you can describe. You can try to, but things are going to change and it doesn't make any sense. And so, that's something that really mathematics and science are just describing the patterns that God has put in place. They're not patterns that mankind created. They are simply patterns that are observable or have been observable in different parts of nature and different parts of creation. And so we have this word uniformity. We looked at it once at the beginning of the lesson and once really in that last slide. And that idea of uniformity is that God's creation follows laws that allow us to perform scientific inquiry. And so, sometimes you hear it a lot now on the news in a very political sense of, I believe science or I believe scientists. Well, what does that mean? Scientists are just people that they observe something and they try to reproduce those results, because if there really is a pattern, then someone in a completely different location with a different set of circumstances should be able to find a similar answer. And so relating that to the COVID stuff, that's one reason why you really can't trust anything anybody's saying, is because the results in one place don't match up to the results in another place. And so it's not that things that are happening are random, but it's that there's not enough information for anyone to say this is the pattern, this is the way things are working. And because of that, and because politicians have gotten a hold of it, we all know what they do with anything, and it's ruin it. That's why there's so much animosity and confusion and chaos as far as that goes. But none of that comes from God. The animosity and confusion and chaos do not come from God, because we know God's creation does follow laws and patterns that we're able to observe, and we're able to reproduce, not in the sense that we're creating them, but we're able to reproduce our observations as we go. Now, this doesn't mean that everything happened the exact same way from the very beginning of time until now. We know that God operates outside of these laws, and at any point in time, if he wants something to happen differently, then he makes it happen differently. And that's really what we call, that's one way we can define a miracle. A miracle is a break from these patterns, a break from these laws that is caused by God's will and God's doing. Certainly, we cannot ever rule those things out. And when something can't be explained by what we're able to observe, then we need to understand either we're observing it wrong, we don't have all the information, or it's very possible that God, decided to, he's the one that put the laws in place, he's the one that put the patterns in place, and he decided through the works of his hands to break that up for good or for a certain period of time, something like that. So we don't need to confuse uniformity in God's law with the fact that God is breaking his law. God can come in and make things happen the way he wants to at any point in time, right? When Joshua prayed that the sun stand still, and God made the sun stand still, I've never seen the sun stand still, but I'm also not God, and I can't make that happen. And so it does not rule out God being able to interject his will and his work into creation at any point in time. So the biblical ice age. We're going to now do something a lot different than we would normally do. And I'm going to stop talking and get out of this PowerPoint, and we're going to put up a video from Answers in Genesis, where a meteorologist and researcher named Michael Oard is going to speak a little bit on this idea of an ice age from a biblical perspective and a biblical background. Remember, we talked about how the Bible does not actually discuss an ice age, but that doesn't mean that the principles found in the Bible aren't going to coincide with maybe some scientific discovery. So I'm going to stop talking. I'll put the video up. I hope you stick around and watch it, and then we'll talk about some applications of this lesson at the end. I think the video itself is probably roughly 30 minutes long, so this is just a part of a lecture from this meteorologist about the Ice Age. Okay, so again, this is a video about the Ice Age from Michael Oard, a meteorologist.
Was there an ice age? Well, when you examine the superficial sediments, the sediments that are on the surface of the earth, in presently glaciated areas, you see a number of features. Now, this is the beautiful Athabasca Glacier in the Canadian Rockies that has been receding. This sign right there That's where it was in 1890, and yet it has been receding. And when it leaves behind, you can examine what an ice does. It leaves behind rocks of all sizes within usually sand and silt, kind of in a finer grain matrix. It leaves behind end moraines and lateral moraines. End moraines and lateral moraines are formed when the glacier pushes out material ahead of it. And as it's along the side, it's called a lateral moraine. When it's in the front, it's called a terminal or end moraine. Speaking of this, I can't help but make a comment on global warming. Yes, all glaciers of the world have been receding, or mostly all. And yes, it is true there has been global warming, and I believe it is true that man has been a cause of it, but I believe that nature is part of it too, because between 1350 and 1850, we had the Little Ice Age, where all the glaciers in the world advanced. Now we're in the opposite fluctuation where they're receding. So I think this is partly due to the effects of the sunshine and less volcanic ash in the stratosphere, why we're getting some of the global warming. There's a beautiful end moraine, very sharp looking, made not too long ago, probably made about 1890. Another feature you observe around glaciated areas is scratched bedrock. As the glacier moves over bedrock, it has rocks in the bottom of it, and those rocks in the bottom scratch the bedrock. So it's typical to see striated bedrock, or pavement as they call this. Also, some of the rocks themselves get scratched, and a lot of times they get scratched in different directions. Here's one set going that way, and there's another set going this way, like this. And it's probably because the rock turned a little bit in the ice. The ice is more plastic and malleable, so that's probably why you have striations in different directions on rocks. So those are some of the features we see in currently glaciated areas. So let's extend those to features where it's claimed to have been glaciated. Here's one area where I used to live, west of Great Falls, Montana, near Augusta, Montana. This is the Rocky Mountain front. The Rocky Mountains were glaciated during the Ice Age, and the ice came about 10 miles out onto the high plain and formed this end moraine, just typically is what you see at the Athabasca Glacier. I'm taking a picture of this from this part of the end moraine right here. It was breached right in here. Probably when the glacier melted, it breached through the end moraine right here, so that's why there's a gap there. When you look at the material in the end moraine, it's very similar to glaciers you see today. It's rocks of all sizes in a finer grain matrix surrounding the rocks. Typically, they call that glacial till. Also, when you go up into the Rocky Mountains, you see scratched bedrock going east. In fact, there's an 800-foot cliff right along here. The glacier came up out of this valley, scratched the bedrock, and went down over an 800-foot cliff. Also, you find in the moraine that I showed you previously, you find rocks that are scratched in several different directions. Typical what you see in glaciated areas. And this is in an area that gets up in the 80s for high temperatures in the summertime. Also, as you tour around the west, you see that out of some of the mountain valleys of the western U.S., you see moraines, just like you see at Athabasca Glacier. This is probably one of the best moraines that I've ever seen before. This is the horseshoe-shaped lateral end moraines around beautiful Wallowa Lake in northeast Oregon. It moved out onto the Enterprise Plain in northeast Oregon, about 4,000 feet altitude, where it gets probably a high temperature of 90 as the average in July. There's the lateral moraine, end moraine, and lateral moraine. They're fairly sharp looking, indicating that the Ice Age ended not that long ago. Furthermore, a feature like this could not form during the flood. This feature has to form by other mechanisms, and it's on top of flood sediments, so the Ice Age occurred after the flood. And here's another picture of that lateral moraine. You can see the trees for scale. This lateral moraine is 600 feet tall. And here's what you see within the lateral moraine: glacial till, rocks of all sizes in a finer grain matrix. And you see these around the Sierra Mountains and other Wind River Mountains of the western United States. Also, you see these erratic boulders here and there. Most of them I see are kind of sub-rounded or rounded. I think that a lot of erratics were transported by water. This one is very angular. This is the famous Okotoks erratic southwest of Calgary, Alberta. This forms a line of erratics from Jasper, Alberta, down into northern Montana, just kind of a line, and very angular, which means they didn't roll down there. Probably they were deposited by icebergs as ice was melting. Here's another famous erratic called the Bellevue erratic. Now this erratic is, erratic boulder is a boulder rock that doesn't outcrop in the local area. It's been transported somehow. That's what they mean by an erratic boulder, or exotic boulder is another name. This one is found southwest of Portland, Oregon, in the Willamette Valley. It's composed of argillite, which is a slightly metamorphosed shale, and the nearest outcrop of that is in northern Idaho. And it's well south of the ice, where the boundary of the ice, by the way. How did it get down there? And it's very angular. The only way you can think about it is on an iceberg. And how would an iceberg take it down there? Well, when Glacial Lake Missoula broke, it spread through eastern Washington, through the Columbia Gorge, and spread over Portland, Oregon, 400 feet deep and up into the Willamette Valley. So if there was a Glacial Lake Missoula and a Lake Missoula flood, there had to be a thick ice dam in northern Idaho to block up the water in the Clark Fork Valley, indicating again that the ice age was a real event. So when you sum it all up, this is the big picture right here. Ice covered practically all of Canada. Just a little bit in the Yukon Territory was unglaciated. It came down in the northern United States to around, they claim, northern Missouri, and I'm not quite sure of that. That's a subject of research, but it got pretty far south of the Great Lakes, and it covered some of the mountain areas as ice caps. But interesting enough, in Alaska, the Brooks Range and Alaska Range, they were glaciated, but the lowlands of Alaska were not glaciated. And that's where you find all those woolly mammoths, bisons, and horses, and lots of animals in Ice Age permafrost in those areas. When you go to Europe and Asia, this is a general feature where the ice was. It covered much of England and northern Germany and Poland, and clear out into northwest Siberia. Now, there's a little question on the boundary right in here, and some people think that the ice covered the Barents Sea north of Norway there. So there's still some controversy over the exact distribution of the ice. But when you add it all up, ice covered 30% of the continental areas. The closest ice to this area would have been up in Pennsylvania. Can we explain it? Well, I believe we can. First of all, we can tell from the clues that it's post-flood. It's on the surface of flood sediments, and we definitely don't have it today in the present climate. The ice sheets in Canada are gone. So it must have happened in a transitional climate from the flood to the present climate. Well, that means the flood could have caused the ice age. Well, indeed, I believe that is the case. So let's see how the Genesis flood fulfills the requirements for an ice age. Well, the flood was a giant volcanic tectonic event. Tectonic is crustal earth movements. But at the end of the flood, you have a huge shroud of volcanic dust and aerosols. Aerosols are fine particles about a micron in diameter. They would be floating on the stratosphere. What they do, what we know from modern volcanic eruptions, they cause cooler temperatures, especially in summer and over the large land masses. So after the flood, you'd have so much volcanic ash and aerosols that you'd cause a pretty good cooling right off the bat. Also, the fountains of the Great Deep and volcanism cause a warm ocean. There's lots of ways to cause a warm ocean in any flood model, but the fountains of the Great Deep imply that there was water trapped in the crust, and it came up. And at the end of the flood, that warm water coming from the crust would have been added to the current oceans, resulting in a warm ocean from top to bottom and pole to pole. You could probably swim in the Arctic Ocean right after the flood. It was so warm. There'd be no sea ice. Anyway, the significance of the warm water is that the warmer the water, the more the evaporation. In fact, at 86 degrees Fahrenheit, you would have 7 times the amount of evaporation of water than at 0 degrees centigrade or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Huge amount of evaporation with warmer water. Also, the mechanism is going to persist, but it's going to wane with time as the volcanic ash settles out, and the Earth settles down to equilibrium, and the oceans cool. Particularly the oceans cooling is the key for the waning of the Ice Age. Here's kind of a schematic of how this would work. The volcanic dust and aerosols would reflect some of the sunlight back to space, cooling the surface of the Earth, mainly the land masses at mid and high latitudes. Now, volcanic ash and aerosols filter out of the atmosphere, sink out of the atmosphere in about 1 to 3 years. So you have to keep replenishing the stratosphere after the flood. And indeed, there's a tremendous amount of Ice Age volcanism in Ice Age sediments, indicating we had tremendous volcanism for quite a while after the flood. Now, they know that, uniformitarians notice that, and they know volcanism causes cooling, but you know, when they stretch out the Ice Age into a 2 million year period, it's nothing. But when we telescope it into a short time scale, it becomes very, very significant. Now, with basic meteorology, you can guesstimate, that's meteorological jargon, the storm tracks during the Ice Age. Storm tracks would be in areas where you have strong horizontal temperature differences. And where would they be? They would generally be between the cold, cool land and the warm ocean. So you'd have a storm track parallel with the East Coast. Also, another storm track would be cold ice sheet and a little bit warmer land here. So you'd have a storm track just south of the ice sheet. And storms would generally follow these. Now, these are general storm tracks. In meteorology, chaos usually rules, so these are just general. And most of the time, precipitation in wintertime storms falls on the north side of the storm. So it'd fall right in there where the ice was building up. In this schematic, this is where the ice is still building up. Also, you can figure out where the main evaporation areas are. Generally, with west to east flow, you have fairly drier, cooler air from the continent going out over the warmer ocean. That produces strong evaporation on the east coasts of continents. And of course, in Arctic Ocean, close to the land, you'd have strong evaporation. Those are close to the areas at the mid and high latitudes where you want it to evaporate. It's close to where the building ice sheets developed in Canada and the northern United States, and of course, Scandinavia. Now I'm going to go on to support for the model. There's lots of evidence for wet deserts, and I'm going to show you a diagram and a picture coming up, but the evidence shows that the dry areas about 30 degrees north, like the southwest United States, the Dead Sea area, Australia, lots of places were once much wetter. Here's a plot of what's called pluvial lakes in the southwest United States, right in this area. Now, this is just in the Great Basin. There was lakes down in here. Death Valley had a lake about 600 feet deep. This is Lake Bonneville, which is a Great Salt Lake about 6 to 8 times as large, 800 feet deeper. By the way, the average depth of Great Salt Lake today is only 15 feet deep. It was 800 feet deeper during the Ice Age. Now, uniformitarians, how are they going to get a climate change to fill these things up in those areas? It is very difficult. But like I said, in our model, we fill them up first. As the flood drains off, it'll fill up pockets or basins in the land at the end of the flood. And by the way, if you've ever been to these areas, there's beautiful, large shoreline features along this Lake Bonneville here, shorelines and high deltas. If you land at Salt Lake Airport, look out the window along the foothills and you see the shorelines. There's 2 distinct shorelines. In fact, I found shorelines around this lake. It's called Lake Lahontan. Today, you just have a few shriveled remnants of that lake. These lakes right here, they get up to almost 100 degrees now in the summer. I've taken pictures around there. There's a Mono Lake there, Glacial Lake, Mono Lake, and then Death Valley. There's shorelines around Death Valley. Quite a different climate during the Ice Age, a lot wetter. Now, it's interesting that the Sahara Desert was much wetter. Man lived in the Sahara Desert by the thousands, and he has all kinds of rock art. This is a picture of a giraffe on a rock in the Sahara Desert. And I'm going to just summarize a quote from the book, The Great Sahara. The Sahara is a veritable art gallery of prehistoric paintings. The evidence is enough to show that the Sahara was once a well-populated area of the prehistoric world. Yet, there is man's work in the most inaccessible corners of the desert. Literally thousands of figures of tropical and aquatic animals. Yes, aquatic animals. Enormous herds of cattle, hunters armed with bows and boomerangs, and even domestic scenes of women and children in the circular huts in which they lived. Why would the Sahara be much wetter during the Ice Age? Well, because you had a huge amount of evaporation right after the flood. The lowlands of Siberia, Alaska, and the Yukon were unglaciated, and this is a mystery. And here's a plot of the mountains being glaciated, and the lowlands, which are in yellow there, are unglaciated. By the way, most models of the Ice Age have extreme difficulty forming the Ice Age. Extreme difficulty. Now, some will produce it, but a lot of times it's because those models are tweaked to produce it. Anyway, Phillips and Held said in the Journal of Climate, Siberia and Alaska, well, they said, we now have glaciation. They did produce glaciation, but unfortunately, it was outside the areas where it existed during the last Ice Age. And that included the lowlands of Alaska, Siberia, and the Yukon. In other words, those lowlands like to glaciate. Why weren't they glaciated in our model? It's because of all the warm onshore flow. Mainly, it was the onshore flow that kept it ice-free. Now, the woolly mammoths in Siberia. What were millions of mammoths doing in Siberia where they couldn't live today? Mainly because it's boggy, they can't get around, and the bog vegetation is toxic to them because they ate grass. Not only were the woolly mammoths in Siberia, you had woolly rhinoceros, horse, bisons, a lot of different animals that lived in Siberia during the Ice Age. So what's going on? Why these sorts of things? Well, first of all, you got to determine whether the mammoths died during the flood or during the Ice Age. I think from what I've seen, from studied, it's overwhelmingly they died at the end of the Ice Age. One of the main evidence is in northwest Siberia, you find woolly mammoth skeletons on top of glacial till, which means that as the glaciers receded from northwest Siberia, the mammoths came up in that area, and then they died on top. So they died at the end of the Ice Age. That's the distribution right there, all across the northern hemisphere. In fact, you don't find them in areas where the ice lasted the longest, which is much of Canada and northern and central Scandinavia, which is what you'd expect during an Ice Age. And during the Ice Age, they would be able to migrate over a Bering Land Bridge. Now, as the snow piles on land, it evaporates from the ocean, the original water, and the sea level drops. And the Bering Land Bridge is very shallow, so man and animals could easily migrate into the United States and down through an ice-free corridor. They came down here and spread through into the southern United States, Central and South America. Now, a good indication that the climate was quite different during the Ice Age is the distribution of the saga antelope. The solid line there represents the current distribution of the saga antelope, and the dashed line is the historical. Their range is shrinking. But those dots represent Ice Age distributions. You can see them up in northern Siberia. What's so significant about that? Well, the saga antelope has thin hooves, and it likes wide open spaces, plains, and can't negotiate permafrost and swamps very well, indicating that this area was totally different ecologically during the Ice Age than it is there today. During the summers, it's quite a swampland because of the melting of permafrost. Permafrost melts that much, and it has nowhere to go, and so it ponds, and then you get all these plants growing in there, and it becomes a bogland. And it's hardly any animals can live there today in those areas. This is indication that we very likely had no permafrost during the Ice Age. Now, the uniformitarians, I think, have not really faced this problem because they grudgingly might say, well, maybe it was a little warmer climate, but some say, hey, it was during the Ice Age. It had to be a lot colder in Siberia. And they say, oh, that would solve the problem of those bogs. It'd freeze the bogs. Well, if it freezes the bogs, what are they going to eat? And here's a woolly mammoth timeline, whether you start with 2 elephants that leave the ark at the end of the Ice Age or 2 woolly mammoths. I believe it was 2 elephants, and the mastodons and mammoths are part of the elephant kind. But regardless, they're going to grow slowly. They grow slowly, and then finally when their population is going to mushroom by geometric progression. Yes, you have plenty of time for millions of mammoths in a 700-year Ice Age. Finally, towards the end of the Ice Age, the climate changes. It's a dynamic climate. It becomes colder, drier, and windy, and they go extinct at the end of the Ice Age. This is the famous Beresivaka mammoth that was towed out of northeast Siberia, and that's generally the position they found him. It's in the St. Petersburg Museum in St. Petersburg, and it had a broken foreleg, it had broken ribs, broken pelvis, and it was in a general standing position. The question is that really plagues most people is, how did these animals die? Well, I believe the solution is found in the deposits surrounding the mammoths. Let's take a look at what they're buried in. Are they buried in with bog material, river material? Some are in those, I think, but the mass majority of them are in windblown silt. This is a recent quote from a book called Mammoths and the Mammoth Fauna. A particular interest for paleozoologists is what's called the Odama. The Odamas are hills that are formed after permafrost melts around it and then leaves some permafrost as hills. This is actually a loess layer, that is windblown silt, as a rule containing the largest amounts of remains of late Pleistocene animals. They're buried in windblown silt. So what's the picture here? Well, I believe they died in large dust storms, sort of like what happened in the Dust Bowl era. This is a picture from the Dust Bowl era that if you were in a dust storm, you would see just a cloud of this dust coming, and the visibility would go down to zero. There might not be any wind right before it. It'd be like with a cold front. Sometimes there's no wind ahead of a cold front. Suddenly, the winds just really pick up, and the visibility drops to zero. And dust drifts, talk about dust drifts. During the Dust Bowl eras, dust drifts covered up fences, machinery. This one is up to the tops of a house. And by the way, I believe that the amount of windblown silt in those areas of Siberia, some places is over 100 feet thick. So I believe you had worse dust storms up there in Siberia than you did in the Dust Bowl era. Then you might ask, well, why are we going to have late Ice Age dust storms? Well, because of colder winters, colder oceans, which means more sea ice, which also means a drier atmosphere, and stronger north-south temperature differences, all resulting in lot stronger winds and dry, cold fronts, lot drier, cold fronts. So here's the big picture. Woolly mammoth, peacefully eating grass and buttercups. Yes, buttercups. The reason we have those is because they were in his mouth and in its stomach, half decayed. The digestion of a woolly mammoth doesn't occur in the stomach. It occurs after the stomach, by the way. I think that's a key to why the vegetation's only half decayed. But anyway, the winds come up. Uh-oh, he's going to ride it out. Guess what? He ends up like a snow fence. And what happens to snow fences? The snow piles up around it. The dust would pile up. He's starting to suffocate. And he's in a standing position. He tries to get out, and he breaks his right arm leg bone because it appears that he was alive when that front leg broke. And by the way, there's an analog for this in Hot Springs, South Dakota, where some of the mammoths that fell into that sinkhole, they've excavated 52 mammoths in Hot Springs, South Dakota in a sinkhole. Some of them have broken forelimbs also, that the researcher there thinks it was because they're trying to get out of the mud. In this case, the dust packing up would be almost like concrete. Finally, other dust storms totally cover him up. And he ends up in a standing position in the dust. And how do you get him in the permafrost? This has always been a major question. One person said, do you jam him into the permafrost? No, the permafrost in this case will come up to meet him. And by the way, permafrost also shifts and faults once you get it up there. And the faulting can break the pelvis of the Beresivaka mammoth and its ribs. So in a nutshell, that's the story of how I believe they went extinct. Also, something called disharmonious associations. They find, as a rule, you have animals that love the heat and love the cold that were buried in Ice Age deposits together. In the book Quaternary Extinctions of Prehistoric Revolution, it said the late Pleistocene communities, that's Ice Age communities, were characterized by the coexistence of species that today are allopatric, translated, not climatically associated, and presumably ecologically incompatible. Disharmonious associations have been documented for late Pleistocene Ice Age floras, that's your plants, terrestrial invertebrates, lower invertebrates, birds, and mammals. In fact, it was common. And that's exactly what you expect, because this distribution would occur with cool summers and mild winters. While in the uniformitarian model, you have cold winters, period. You shouldn't expect that. One of the most outrageous instances is in England, where you have 100 associations of hippos with musk ox and reindeers in the same stratigraphic layer. How do hippos get up there during the Ice Age? Well, because I believe Britain was warm with a lot of warm onshore flow for quite a while and very wet, very heavy precipitation. So the hippo, after the flood and leaving the ark, would find it congenial up in there. And finally, as the temperatures cooled off, he found himself in the wrong environment, and he was being populated by reindeer and muskox and woolly mammoths. And finally, they all died and were buried in what it says here in this quote. In stratigraphic context, it seemed to indicate contemporary. In other words, they died at the same time. Also, they found out that when things were supposed to get better at the end of the Ice Age, it was warming up, the ice was melting. Suddenly, all these large animals disappeared on whole continents or went extinct all over the world. End Ice Age extinctions. 100 species of large animals in North America, that's 70%, died at the end of the Ice Age, including the horse and the camel. Europe and Asia lost 75% at the end of the Ice Age. Australia lost 90% at the end of the Ice Age. Why? Well, I think it's the same reason they were lost in Siberia. It was colder, drier, and windier. I think the dust storms, which there's lots of evidence, was a prime factor in the extinctions at the end of the Ice Age. Here's a quote from a recent book. After many decades of debate, the North American end-Pleistocene megafaunal mass extinction remains a lightning rod of controversy. The extraordinary divergent opinions expressed in this volume show that no resolution is in sight. I would say it can readily be explained in the post-flood Ice Age model.
All right, so that was a fairly long video, a lot of information. Some of it might have gone over your head, might have gone over my head, but in general, this is an opportunity to see some science from a perspective that's not the perspective that you're going to see in school, not from the evolutionary perspective, but from the perspective that this is what the Bible teaches. This is our foundation for truth. And all of these discoveries, when we really use our head and think through it critically, can certainly be fit into the biblical time frame. And they need to be, because we know that whatever the Bible teaches, that is the truth. And if we're trying to create a different quote-unquote truth based on scientific discoveries instead of being based on God's Word, that's always going to be a problem and problematic, and leads to really the degradation of society as a result. So we're now going to switch gears again and look at some applications, both of what we looked at in that video, as well as what we've looked at this week and the past few weeks of God's promises, God's faithfulness, the flood, the Ice Age, and all those things together. So here it says, it might be a little hard to think about this topic from the perspective of the gospel, but the Ice Age is a part of history. And so how might the Ice Age be a part of discussions about the truth of the gospel? And one thing, and this is almost kind of one of those answers you would give a student in school when they say, why do I ever need to know this? Well, you just never know when things are going to come up in conversation. You never know when you will be confronted with a topic that you didn't necessarily know much about. And that doesn't mean that we're going to know everything about everything, but any little tool we can put in our bag to have an intelligent conversation about something and understand at least a few key points so that we can take a conversation back to the gospel, that's what we want to do. So, this is another one of those situations. I don't know if I've ever spoken with the Ice Age about anyone except for last night. Believe it or not, before in recording this lesson and studying for this lesson, my oldest son asked me something about the Ice Age. So I said, you know what, here's some information about it. So that was pretty cool. And that led to a bigger conversation of how we need to keep the Bible as our foundation instead of letting scientists be our foundation. Anything that a scientist finds or observes has to coincide with God's Word. If it doesn't, then that's a problem. So that's one application. Let's look at the next question. It says, is it important for each of you to know the details and inner workings of the latest Ice Age models as you seek to share the gospel with others? And the answer is a big fat no. It's really not that important. It's important that you understand the basics of it, and just like we understand the basics of really anything else that may come up in conversation. I think about the Apostle Paul a lot. The Apostle Paul was a highly educated, well-rounded individual, in that it didn't matter if he was speaking to the Jews, if he was speaking to the Gentiles, if he was speaking at Mars Hill with all the great thinkers and philosophers. He was comfortable speaking in all the situations, and he took every situation back to the gospel. But that doesn't mean you have to be a renowned scientist or have a great deal of knowledge in any of these areas. The important part is understanding, okay, hey, there was an ice age. It fits into the biblical model. Let's turn this conversation to Jesus. How could you respond to someone who asks you a question about the ice age or any other topic that you were unable to answer? Well, the first thing you do is you don't make stuff up. For some reason, I've known people, and I've been guilty of it too, maybe you have as well, that you think you have to have an answer for everything. We need to have an answer for the hope we have in Jesus Christ. When it comes to anything that any other topic that's on the fringe, like the Ice Age, if you don't know, you can say, you know what, I have no idea. But you can also follow up with, but I will look that up for you, or I will find someone that can help us get that answer. And you take them to a biblical source of truth. We know the Bible doesn't explicitly talk about the Ice Age a lot, but you take someone like the meteorologist we just looked at. You take someone like the Answers in Genesis website and other resources that are out there that are going to approach these scientific topics from a biblical perspective and with a biblical foundation. Many people are afraid of the effects of global warming. How does Genesis 8 verses 20 through 22 give you assurance of the future? So remember, in that passage, we're looking at the patterns that God's going to uphold for the rest of the earth's life cycle until Jesus comes back, that there's going to be summer and winter and cold and heat and day and night. There's another one that's just not popping in my head right now, but does that mean that global warming can't happen? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Now, we can debate about the reasons why and the policies that should be put in place, but the earth can warm up, the earth can cool down. It has before, and it certainly can currently be doing that or do whatever it wants to do, based on these different cycles, based on a lot of different scientific things and processes that God has put in place. But we know that the earth's not going to all flood. God already said he was going to flood the earth again. We already know that the earth's not going to pass away in a timetable that catches God by surprise, right? So there's not going to be some extinction level event that wipes us all out because of global warming. Could things change? Certainly. Could weather patterns change? Of course. Could climate change? Yeah. Could it warm up, cool down? All of those things could happen, and certainly there is historical evidence for some of those things. But we need to understand that God is in control regardless of what changes are happening in the weather and the environment and sickness and diseases, whatever the case is. God is in control, and we trust that God is going to provide for us in a way that ultimately brings him the most glory. How does understanding that God is faithful give you assurance as his child? Well, we understand that God, if he tells us something, then he's going to keep that promise. He's going to be true to his word, and he's going to be true to the things he says. And so when God says something, you can take your hands off of it because you're not in control anyway, and you don't need to try to steer the ship any other direction. God's got this, and so let's let God be in control when he says he's in control. And guess what? That's all the time. Are you aware of any models from biblical creationists that have changed over time? This question may hit you like, what? I don't know any models from biblical creationists. I don't even know what this phrase means. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I'll mention a few simply because they were in the Answers in Genesis lesson. Specifically, a lot of these biblical models are going to deal with questions like, how do we see starlight if light travels at a certain speed and these stars are supposedly so this far away, or where did all the water come from in the flood, and how did we have this and that happen? So there's this one particular theory called the canopy theory that said that we used to have a thicker atmosphere and there's basically a water layer that surrounded the earth, and that when the flood happened, in addition to the floodwaters rising from the earth, inside the earth's surface, this canopy basically broke open and all the water in the atmosphere fell down, and that was the source of rain. And it sounded like a good, I mean, the first time I heard it, I thought, well, okay, well, that makes sense. Well, apparently, not digging into it deeper, there were some scientific issues with that. It didn't really mesh with other findings, and ended up being a contradictory model. So people have really steered away from that. Biblical creationists have steered away from that model. But guess what? This happens in science all the time, with whatever perspective you're coming from. It doesn't matter if you have a biblical foundation or a secular foundation. People come up with models, and sometimes those models work. Sometimes new information is presented, and you think, "Oh, that was a bad model. Who knows?" I've done it before. I published a paper, and it was based on a good model, and then by the time my paper was published, there was the scientist that it was based on said, "You know what, that model wasn't very good. Here's a new model." Now, it didn't mean my work was bad, but it was based on a bad model. And the bad model wasn't someone trying to fool anyone. It was the best they had at the time. Then they found better information and came up with a better model. So it has nothing to do with whether the Bible is true or not. We know the Bible is always true. We, as the broken, fallible, sin-filled human beings in a broken, fallible, sin-filled world, are not going to come up with perfect answers all the time, either because we can't understand fully what's going on, or we don't have enough information to come up with the proper conclusion. So our results that we find and that scientists find have no bearing on the Bible whatsoever. The Bible stays true, and it's our job to come up with things that match up with the Bible, not for the Bible to match up with what we find. How can you use God's creation to offer him praise for his attributes? Well, just look around. Literally, look around today and just notice all the awesome things God's created. And just the variety in which he's created them. It's amazing when you think about how creative our God is, how awesome our God is, the fact that we still have these, thousands and thousands of species of animals and plants, and the way that he's created every human being with similarities, but they are completely unique. We have a God that is much bigger than we can process, and that we even try to process in most of our day-to-day lives. And so take some time today, walk through the woods, drive around, look around, open your eyes. When the sun goes down, look up. If it's not too cloudy, look at the stars, look at the moon, and all these wonderful things that God has put in place simply because he can. And let's praise him for loving us. Let's praise him for providing for us. Let's praise him for being faithful in the promises that he has made, even though we are sinful and we are full of sin and evil intentions. We serve an awesome God, and we need to spend time letting him know that, because that's the praise that he deserves and requires. So that is the end of our lesson. I hope that you've learned something. I know I certainly have, and I hope you all have a great week. Take care.